Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Classical Academy podcast right here at Trinity Classical Academy. This is your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Phillips. My guest today is Zach Weichbrodt. He teaches medieval literature. He's our senior thesis class advisor. He's chair of Trinity's Humanities Department and the dean of classical learning, one of the hardest working, if not the hardest working person right here at Trinity. He has a bass, deep, melodic, velvet voice that could inspire 1,000 Helens, thus launch 1,000,000 ships. He's a great soccer coach. But we're going to hear first from this man with the mustache envied by Tom Selleck about his Romeo and Juliet story and his wonderful wife, Elise. Zach, before we get started, would you tell us about that, please, sir?
Sure, but I don't want Tom Selleck hunting me down. I think you've elevated that a little higher than it goes.
No, you wouldn't.
So I guess one of the best ways to put this is my future wife forgave me for dying poorly. Whenever we were in college, we were dating, and we had the experience, as all college lovers do, of portraying Romeo and Juliet in a theater production. And on the last night of the performance, I just got a little too excited at the part where Romeo rips open the maw of the tomb where he thinks Juliet is buried, and ended up losing this vial of poison that, if you know the play, is kind of crucial for the rest of the events that follow, where Romeo drinks the poison and ends up killing himself in despair over Juliet. But having lost the poison, and probably spending an extra 5 minutes or so slowly trying to look for it as I uttered my last monologue, I decided that the best idea would be to do just improv another death. And of course, stabbing myself with a dagger was on my mind, because somewhere in the recesses of my imagination, I remember that's how Juliet happens to die. So I decided to, instead of just miming a vial of poison, to use the dagger that was my prop kind of in the belt and stabbing myself, even though it made no sense with the words, which of course put her, my future wife Elise, in the unenviable position of having to utter a bunch of dialogue that made no sense, because so much of it was about the poison that still rests on his lips, that she can still smell and she can still taste. And she made sure to put special emphasis on all of those words that the audience, unless they knew the play, had zero meaning or understanding for. But I'm happy to say that she forgave me enough to marry me later on.
Wow. Now, how did she recover? Well, did she do a nice job that evening covering?
Well, at that point, I was just trying to cover my losses and be the best dead corpse I possibly could. So the audience was certainly appreciating her. I'll say that.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, we want to talk tonight about Dante's Inferno, something that is studied here. We talked in our last podcast about why it is we look at the great books, and this is the Divine Comedy. It's the first section of the trilogy, and this is certainly one of those great books. As Christians, why would we want to study Dante's Inferno, and what is the classical reason for doing that?
Sure. So there is almost as many reasons to answer that question as there are lines in the Inferno, but maybe the ones that come out to mind most quickly are the simple fact that Dante wrote probably the greatest imaginative work that any Christian outside the Bible has ever written. And we could argue more, maybe with some other future and past podcast guests, over it being the greatest imaginative work of literature, but it certainly stands as the greatest Christian imaginative work that's been produced beyond Scripture.
Fantastic. So as a Christian who goes into reading the Inferno for the first time, what can they hope to see? What will be the purpose for them personally by the time they finish? What will be new and enriching in their lives?
I want to give two answers in the form of an image. The first is Dante writes a cathedral in words. If you think about touring Europe or visiting some of those great and glorious locations where we see the history and the civilization, the culture of the Western world epitomized, and you think about the center points of those cities. What's in the center of the town square? Oftentimes, it's this grand, glorious cathedral. And in those cathedrals, they serve not just as spaces for worship, spaces where we can experience and reflect on the glory of God. But visually, they reflect the best and highest of human ingenuity, of man's design, not to show off just human ingenuity, but to point towards the heavens, to point towards God as their climbing spires so often do architecturally. And Dante is seeking to do that same thing with his gift of words, is to erect this beautifully designed edifice that takes in all of the light from the surrounding world, but ultimately reflects it upward, pointing towards God himself.
So in and of itself, it's a literary spire, the way you described it. So Dante does this great work. Who is this man? Tell us about him.
So Dante, and this is one of the things that makes reading the Inferno a little tricky, because Dante places himself as a character in his own work. The other image or symbol to think about the Inferno especially as is a map for the lost. Dante starts this story off by pointing out that as humans, we are all lost. We are so deeply lost that we don't even know how we got lost. We are so deeply lost that we have no bearings to find where we might be. And he imagines this as a dark, terrifying forest at the beginning of the Inferno. And so as the narrator, as the writer, he places himself as a central character in this story and tells how, by the grace of God, he goes from being lost to being found.
Now, does he actually share some of his own struggles and his own wrestlings throughout this journey? I know he's going through these 3 rings, and we can talk about that more later, but does some of Dante himself come out in this work?
Oh, absolutely. So that's one of the great marks of Dante's genius in the Inferno, is he takes everything that he so vividly felt and experienced in his life as a statesman, as a politician, as a military officer, as a poet, as a writer. He takes all of those personal, intimate experiences of his life and places them on the same level as characters from the Bible, as legendary heroes from myth and legend. And they all become part of the same journeys. So where the little details that he experienced as what was otherwise an ordinary medieval life in the 13th century has the same drama and grandeur and epic quality as what we see from Achilles in Homer, or what we see from even Paul's experiences of conversion in the scripture. So he's always trying to incorporate every aspect of reality that's conceivable into the story, into his story that he wants to tell, not just as the story of one Italian guy wandering around, but he thinks ultimately the story of every human being in that experience of being lost, then found.
Wow. So someone who has never read it, or maybe they read it a long time ago, let's start, before we dive into it, let's kind of start with an overview of this dark forest where he finds himself, who his guide is. His blessed wife Beatrice sent him to him. Let's start with an overview of Dante's Inferno.
So the Inferno, as you hinted at, is the first of several works of what's ultimately called the Divine Comedy. And the Inferno is probably the most popular one, the one that maybe has inspired the imagination of more readers in the centuries that passed since its composition. And it has some of the crazy things, right? Popes being condemned to hell in this imaginative work by a man who himself was a faithful Catholic. Visions of demons, visions of fire and brimstone, and all kinds of mind-bogglingly imaginative scenarios where we see the depths of human sin and despair being plumbed in incredible detail. So that is going to be one of the first steps of his journey. That's not just meant to take a grotesque look inward into the grossness of what we see in the human soul consumed by sin, but ultimately the first of several steps that will lead him to man's proper home, redeemed by grace with his Creator in the heights of paradise.
Now, when you mention popes condemned, was that a dangerous thing to write? Was this controversial in any way at the time?
Absolutely. So the history of the Western canon is replete with men and sometimes women as well who wrote things that certainly got them into hot water, whether that led to exile, whether that led to some kind of legal penalty. In Dante's case, though, he was already kind of playing with house money in one sense, because by the time he was writing this work, the Divine Comedy, he had been exiled from his beloved city for a a variety of reasons, mostly political. But he had been separated and sundered from his wife, from his children, from his family, his friends, and pretty much everything that he knew and held dear. So even though it would come at a cost, he was already having paid much of that cost himself, and so felt a certain kind of freedom to call things as he saw them, and in a way that he thought would have maybe a kind of a proto-reformational effect on the church, on the political sphere, on the cultural life of Europe at the time.
Right. So proto-reformational, a nice word. So in other words, he already was in a position of danger or a position of conflict, and this perhaps, as you said, did give him the freedom to go all out here and to place some people within one of these three rings of hell that might be taken by some of those in authority as they might not take it correctly. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So another question for the students or from the students who have studied it. As we get into the deepest ring of hell, it's strange because we think of fire, we think of brimstone, and yet these creatures in there are frozen in ice. Tell us about this move on Dante's part. Why this ice in hell?
One of the things that's amazing to see and consider is how much Dante has influenced how we think about hell. Even if we've never read him before, so many of the popular ideas in our imagination about what hell is come from this particular source of the Inferno in the Divine Comedy. But one way he plays with that expectation is, even though the journey downward into the depths of hell is filled with demons and whips and flames and geysers of fire and horrible monsters of various kinds, there are some curious places in hell where things get cold, very, very cold, freezingly cold. And Dante is a poet who's always trying to show us more. Right, show us more in the things that are right in front of us. And so whenever he switches the temperature knob, right, whenever he cranks it all the way down, and this is most memorably the case at the very end, the bottom of hell where Satan himself dwells is covered in freezing ice. And the sinners there who have committed for Dante the worst sin, the sin of betrayal, of treachery, are represented by the arch traitor himself, Satan, Lucifer, right, who not only turned his back on God and betrayed his creator, but also is constantly instigating people on earth to do the same, to drive a wedge of separation between God and those whom he has made. But ironically, Satan is no longer that free angel roaming about like a roaring lion as the New Testament presents him, or even that angel of light as arguably the Old Testament presents him. He's a hideous, slobbering, vomiting, bleeding, weeping creature who is stuck up to his chest in ice and who is freezing by the ferocious breath and wings that he is relentlessly beating all the rest of hell. Hell is characterized geographically by these varieties of rivers that Dante learned from Virgil and others of his classical ancestry. And he presents us this vision that at its core, sin isn't about heat. Sin is about coldness. It's about lifelessness. It's about disconnection and isolation. So even that great figure of Lucifer, who we think about as this monstrous opposing force, is shown in that cold, broken lifelessness of sin to be frozen, stuck. And the worst that he can do is to continue to betray himself and all those who shared in his sin by, with the flapping of his wings, vainly rebelling against God's sentence to plunge him into the depths of hell, but in so doing ensuring that he once again simply just stays stuck in the darkest place, furthest removed from God's presence.
Frozen in his own treachery, yes. Okay, I think this is exciting. I think we're gonna dive into the Inferno a lot deeper in our second part, and I want to find out who his host is. Why did he pick Virgil? Let's hear about that, and go into some of the journey. We don't want to give it away. We want people reading it on their own, and then and then talk to people about some of their own queries they may have from this. So we'll be right back after this, and we're going to dive in to the Inferno a little bit more with Mr. Weichbrodt. Can't wait till part 2. Welcome back to the Classical Academy podcast, your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. We're talking with Mr. Zach Weichbrodt, and we're talking specifically about the Inferno, the first canto of the Divine Comedy. And so we set the stage a little bit. Dante himself is the character within this canto, and he wakes up, finds himself in a dark forest. Let's take it from there. So, Mr. Weichbrodt, here we go. He's got a problem. He's facing these 3 great beasts. Where does he want to go? What does he have to do to get there? What happens? And what are the key turning points in this journey of where he wants to go?
Great questions. So one of the geniuses of Dante is how simple he makes the universe and the drama of human salvation. Dante is lost in a dark wood, and so he wants to get to the light. Dante wants to go and rise to the heights of heaven, so he has to go down into the darkest depths of the Inferno.
So what's standing in his way? I mean, why can't he why does he have to pass through this journey through hell?
So again, we could answer with a whole host of different answers and maybe sound like people who are defending our own problems, right? And pointing out all the obstacles that stand in our way. And one of the clear answers that Dante gives from his own story, right? He's not afraid to wash his own laundry in this particular poem, is to say that he is the thing standing in his own way. That as he is emerging first in that opening canto of the Inferno, emerging out of the dark forest, he sees a hill robed with light from the sun. And as you referenced, as he is finally for the first time in a long time feeling hope that once again he can get to the light, that he can feel the sweet breath of life again, these 3 different beasts stand in his way. And curiously, though they are lion and she-wolf and leopard, they don't do much more than make a lot of noise and bare their teeth and get in his own way. He can't summon in himself the courage and the hope that he needs to overcome these obstacles, and turns back towards the darkness. And as he is making his way sadly, morosely, dejectedly back into that darkness, having lost out on that chance to get the light, he meets and hears and sees someone that he thinks he recognizes. This man, or as he says, not quite a man, but a shade, a sort of ghostly figure that he's never met in his own life, but whose voice and whose words he recognizes as the great Italian poet Virgil.
And sent by his beloved deceased wife, I understand, Beatrice.
Yeah, they play an epic game of heavenly telephone where Virgil, this man who did not live in the time of Christ, despite what a couple of the church fathers might have argued. In Dante's version, he is in this special place in hell called limbo, where having neither merits for salvation by the grace of God, nor having been beset by the worst of sins, he's kind of resting amongst some of the other great heroes and figures of the pagan past. And Virgil finds himself spoken to by the heavenly voice of Beatrice. And I haven't eaten enough cannoli tonight to do a good Italian accent, but Beatrice, as you mentioned, is Dante's great beloved, this woman who in his actual life he saw no more than probably 3 times, but whose beauty and whose radiance and virtue was so obvious. Beatrice, right, means blessedness. And Dante writes in another work that he knew her name before he had ever met her, that idea of blessedness just radiates out from her. So he called her blessed without knowing that was actually her name. So this woman that he meets and inspires him, not just to write poems as maybe any young man might do, but inspires him towards a path of seeking virtue, of seeking grace, of seeking the presence of God because of the beauty of Beatrice. She is this inspirational figure for his life, and she dies before Dante reaches his full maturity. But in in the Inferno, she sees his darkness. She sees his despair. She sees his cowardness from heaven because she's alerted to it by this heavenly chain of these great saints and noble ladies all the way up to the Virgin Mary herself, who, seeing Dante lost and wandering, has pity on him and sends ultimately Beatrice to ultimately send Virgil to be his guide on a journey that will save his soul.
Wow, fantastic. A really good reason to find the right mate. So what's the first key turning point here? Once Virgil comes to him, or this ghostly figure Virgil, which is, I guess, is that interpreted as kind of Virgil's voice in his head? Although he is truly a guide, he's a parent, he's a defender through this journey. What's the first turning point?
So in the story, Virgil is physically, corporeally there, right? His body is there. He's speaking as the Virgil that is known. And Dante, living many centuries after Virgil, knows him only through the poems that Virgil wrote. And even having never met him in person, Dante still calls him my master, my teacher, my father, my guide. And seeing tangibly, physically in front of him, this figure that he knows and trusts is what inspires Dante to take the next step in his journey. Because if he was afraid of walking up a hill to some beasts, the vision that Virgil casts for him of how he will be saved is certainly far more daunting and daring, of a journey that he has to take down into the darkest depths of hell in order to be led out ultimately into the light again. And so when it was just him, whenever it was just his own virtue or what shreds of it he had, he didn't have enough to even walk up a hill. But now, having been sent by God's grace, this trustworthy father figure, he, Virgil, is one who Dante is willing to follow even into the fires of hell.
Wow. Does he, with his time with Virgil, does he begin to sense Virgil might be missing something about grace? Does that come out in the Inferno?
One of the things that's interesting about that is, as much reverence as Dante has for Virgil, as much as he sees the virtue that Virgil possessed, he's keenly aware of that lack of grace, of that lack of salvation, the thing that he himself needs, that he sees that Virgil lacks. And even in their opening dialogues, Dante calls God the God whom you did not know, the one whom you did not follow. And so he's able to have this tremendous respect on the one hand for a father figure, but also not be so taken up by how amazing Virgil is that he forgets the one thing that's crucially missing from his own life, that grace that will ultimately transform Dante, but that Virgil had missed out on.
Right. So Virgil himself is, while not condemned to the worst parts, he's still condemned to a limbo because of this lack of grace that Dante comes to realize himself he needs. So as the Christian is reading through this, and specifically the students here at Trinity, how does studying the Inferno shape the students? And I know that's a loaded question, and yes, you can take as long as you need to, because that's the whole point of studying it, clearly. But how does it shape the student? Why do we study the Inferno here at Trinity?
Again, there are as many reasons as there are words in the epic, but one reason that comes to mind immediately is how Dante's work provides a model for how to think about the world, even how to think about everything that the students have studied before. So you gave the example of Virgil is a pagan. Does Dante sense that Virgil is missing something? And our students who have read the great works of pagan authors, they've read Aristotle, they've read Plato, they've heard the words of Socrates, they've read the wisdom of Homer and of Thucydides. Sometimes they're also asking that same question, right? Why are we studying these guys? We know they're missing something. We know there's an answer to the questions of life that these guys didn't have. Why do we need to hear their voices? Or maybe at the same time they're wondering, my goodness, there's no way I'm ever going to have the virtue that Socrates had. There's no way I'll have the courage and the bravery and the humility of a Cincinnatus or some of these other great heroes. And how is it that I get something? I think that I can have something better than what they got. How does that work? And Dante is really exploring that, working that out. I called this earlier the greatest imaginative work that a Christian has ever written. And one of the things that fuels Dante is this belief that, reflecting on Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. Dante takes as a starting point this idea, what if everything that is made declares the glory and love of God, whether it be the stars in the sky or the physical geography of the earth or the corruption of the human soul or every event of human history? What if all of these tell of the glory and love of God, even down to the ideas that perhaps God helped lead some of these pagan authors to dimly see and articulate, shadows of the ultimate truth that would come later. And so Dante is more than bold and free to use what he sees as the best and the greatest and the wisest of pagan thought and integrate that into a Christian picture. So Virgil, this great virtuous pagan, is his guide. He can only take Dante so far, but he can guide him through some of the most difficult and dangerous steps of their journey. And that functions as a model for students as well. Why do we study these things? Well, maybe because God has given them a time and a place and a voice in history to guide and shape us. Maybe because, like everything else in the universe, they were given to reveal something about the glory and the love of God that will not distract us from the path that he has laid before us and spelled out so clearly in his word, but that can inspire us to seek that path and see how everything that is contributes to the right steps along that path.
Now, is anybody listening to this can you actually hear this and then not be super excited to jump into the Inferno? I mean, it sounds as though when you talk about Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, even hell itself, from Dante's perspective, seems to be a part of the cosmic fabric. And I know the crucifixion apparently caused fissures within this realm of hell, but all of that's still working together for the glory of God. And you talk about this as the greatest genius work of a Christian, and perhaps that's the greatest genius of all, how it does reflect the glory of God. And what a wonderful thing that the students can delve into this. And for those out there who want to think about some questions you might want to ask, once your child or your grandchild or your friend has read this and studied it right here at Trinity, what might be some questions that they would want to ask of a student who is now a student of the Inferno?
One flows directly from that observation that you just made, Mark, which is, how can hell reveal God? This is a claim that Dante boldly makes as Dante the pilgrim, Dante the character, is journeying downward into hell, which Dante imagines as this kind of dark infernal place that's literally in the center of the earth. And as he starts to pass through into hell, there's these magnificent gates that inscribe a message from their creator, God. And some of the final lines state, "Justice caused my high architect to move. Divine omnipotence created me. The highest wisdom and the primal love." The primal love, the first love for Dante, is part of hell's creation. How is God's love revealed in hell? One of the other aspects of Dante's genius is for all of the literal drama of the story. He intends for his work to also be read on different symbolic levels and layers. Just as he believed that the stars and the physical geography of Earth reveal something about who God is, he also believes they symbolize something about reality, that there's all of these different layers to reality that God could give us eyes to see through careful study and patience and hope. And so one element of this is, as Dante is journeying through this literal vision of hell, this series of 7 rings that are each defined or characterized by a besetting sin. In it, Dante is trying to describe what it looks like for a human soul to go wrong. He also is giving us a picture of not a literal vision of hell, but of the human soul twisted and corrupted. And so we can ask that same question. How does a literal hell reveal God's love? But also, how does sin show us us who God is in his power, in his glory, and in his love. And how, when we are in that stage, in those throes of sin, how does God reveal himself to us and lead us out of that darkness?
Fantastic. Now, this is a very special year, the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. And I understand there are some things happening that we might share with everyone at the time of this recording. This is the 700th year at the time of the recording. We might want to share that, and people might want to take it further and do some more studies. Maybe they'll find it on YouTube eventually. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the celebration of the 700th year?
Sure. There's some amazing Christian colleges and universities that have taken this opportunity to once again give the call for people to start reading Dante again. And so there's a project that's begun called 100 Days of Dante, where on every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, the orchestrators of this event have invited anyone across the world to read one of the cantos of the Divine Comedy. They're sharing a video of an esteemed scholar giving us some insights into that work and giving discussion questions for each of those cantos to invite people further and further along on the journey of the Divine Comedy, which is absolutely appropriate for Dante. He is so much a poet of love. You think about the Christian tradition and the different ways Christians have understood of how we get to God. How do we reach the presence of God? And one of Dante's great ideas, drawing on so much of the Christian traditions of mysticism and spirituality, is to say, God leads us to himself by love. And so unlike some of maybe the monks that you might think of who are renouncing the world and food and all kinds of pleasures and company, sitting alone and praying in their cell, Dante wonders, what if we get to God not by renouncing and rejecting and turning away from everything that he is not, but what if instead we believe that God has filled the universe with things that are lovely and worthy of love, and God intends for us to be led to him by loving what is before us, and then loving the next best thing, and loving the next best thing, and loving the next best thing, all the way up until we are led to love himself in the person of God. And so Dante gives us that journey in his story, and so on this 700th anniversary for this project, to also invite us along that journey of loving the next thing and ascending, hopefully in our contemplation and our thoughts, closer and closer to meditating on God and his presence, I think is very fitting and wonderful.
Very fitting. Ladies and gentlemen, God has graced us with Dante's writing. He's graced us today's podcast with Mr. Weichbrodt, bringing that alive for us. And I hope it's inspired you to look into it for the first time or again for the 12th time, and to ask the questions of those who have studied it and find out the wonderful treasures that are hidden in Dante's Inferno. Thank you for joining us on the Classical Academy podcast presented by Trinity U. This is a service of Trinity Classical Academy right here in Santa Clarita. Our producer is Shay Ramquist. Stephen Petrie is our audio engineer and provides our original music. Until next time, thank you again, Mr. Weichbrodt. This was so enriching and inspiring. I appreciate it. Let's continue to grow in wisdom, in virtue, and in the love of God. See you next time.